So I guess we've got to start off with what's happening just particularly in the last week. We have seen some dramatic developments. I just checked the FT before I came up on stage. It's not the lead story anymore, at least. So the developments have seemed to slow down. It doesn't look like there's going to be 48 votes for a leadership challenge. But I'm just curious to get your take on it, because obviously you're following it very closely. You're the editor of a newspaper now, and what do you make of the developments over the last week?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, Peter, and very exciting actually to see this Fintech conference and how the industry just continues to grow in leaps and bounds, and I hope we can talk about that a bit.
We will.
But I totally understand that Brexit and kind of leadership crises are on people's minds, and you shouldn't just go to the FT for your news, you should go to the Evening Standard.
Of course I should.
What I would say is there are two separate issues. There's the first question of who's the Prime Minister of the country, of great interest, particularly to Conservative MPs. And there is a question of whether there's going to be a challenge to Mrs May's leadership. At the moment, it looks like they haven't got the numbers to trigger it, but who knows? It's a secret process. I think a second and more, in the end, significant question is Britain going to be able to agree a deal that enables it to leave the European Union in an orderly way? And that is still very much up in the air. That's the kind of question that people are asking. There is an agreement reached with the European Union, essentially just on the divorce, i.e. how we leave, the money we pay to leave, and then we're accepting we're going to sign up to EU rules for at least another 4 years, with no agreement on what the sort of end state is going to be, partly because Britain itself doesn't know what the end state should be. It's as divided on the question of our future relationship with the EU as it is on our current relationship. So there is a sort of divorce agreed, but whether it can pass through the British Parliament is very much an open question. At the moment, it looks like the votes aren't there, because the Labour opposition doesn't want to support the government deal. There are Brexit Tories who don't want to support the government's deal. And that's why people at the moment, and indeed the betting markets, if you go on them, are saying there's a roughly equal chance of leaving in this way with a deal and a transition, or going out without a deal. And at the moment, if you went on Betfair, good piece of innovative technology from a few years ago, you would find it's around 50-50. That's where real people are putting their money.
And what about a no Brexit, as in the UK stays in the European Union?
Well, look, my view is that leaving the European Union is a very bad decision for the UK, and by the way, not a good thing for the European Union either. How would you have a second referendum? I think it's generally accepted that there would need to be some democratic event like a referendum before you decided not to leave. It would take place, I think, in the environment where there was a crisis. It was clear that the Parliament was not going to agree a deal. We were heading for a no-deal exit, crashing out of the EU. And in that environment, you could see the argument being made for a second vote. Obviously, there's quite a lot of support for that out in the country, but at the moment, quite limited support inside the House of Commons, where MPs don't want to go back to their constituents and say, let's vote again. I think in a kind of crisis situation, the case for doing that will grow quite rapidly. Ultimately, this will perhaps surprise people in this room, the decision really rests with Jeremy Corbyn, because if he committed the Labour Party to having a second vote, then it would probably pass through Parliament, because it's a hung Parliament, and you would get some Conservative rebels. But he has made every indication at the moment that he is not about to do that. So for those who worry about Jeremy Corbyn being in charge of the fate of the country, here's an early example.
Right. And so do you think that the EU negotiators have not given enough? There's certainly, that was the news last week, that we're being bullied by the EU in the UK, and we're not really standing up for ourselves enough.
No, I think that's just a load of kind of Brexit nonsense, really.
Right.
I mean, they always said, well, the EU needs us more than we need them. We're going to do this great deal with the... I mean, what the EU has done is said, look, we have a set of rules. If you want access to our markets, then you have to abide by the rules. And I think it was always a myth that Brexit was going to produce some sort of special arrangement for the UK, or that we had particular leverage. The moment we voted to leave and decided to leave, we lost that leverage. And now we're the people who absolutely need an agreement.
Right.
And many of you will have done commercial negotiations, but any commercial negotiation where one side absolutely needs a deal and the other side doesn't are not the happiest of negotiations.
Right. Well, it's funny because I was talking with some of the CEOs yesterday here, and the general consensus is that we just want to get this over with.
Yeah.
And so it's like businesses coming around to supporting the deal that's on the table, but it doesn't sound like that deal is really going to pass the House of Commons. So what will it take for the deal to pass the House?
Well, I think first of all, we have to just pause a moment. The deal. The deal is simply a plan for the UK to exit the European Union and continue to obey all the European Union rules, judgments, budgetary requirements, and the like. So we haven't actually done the difficult thing, which is like,
right.
What's the new arrangement? What's the pooling of sovereignty we're prepared to accept outside the EU to have access to European markets? We were always supposed to have that agreed during this period, but now there's no prospect of that. So this deal is very limited in its nature. It's just an arrangement for exiting in an orderly way, and of course has the ironic, if you like, outcome that the UK will have given up whatever control it had as a member of the EU to decide what the laws and rules were that we obeyed. I think the business community, you saw it at the CBI conference, which has been taking place this week as well, are very much of the, can we avoid a no deal, please? And that's totally understandable. But I think the really big questions Britain faces about its immigration policy, its trade policy, its competition policy, and the like, its financial services regime, these have all been parked because under this arrangement, the regime is exactly the same the day after we leave as the day before we leave. It's just a question of what the end state's going to be on those big questions, and no one at the moment has a clear answer.
Okay, so let's move on to other topics. We do want to talk about fintech, and you when you were Chancellor, you were a big supporter of fintech. I believe you helped create, or you were a driving force behind the creation of Innovate Finance and really making London a fintech hub. So just maybe when did you first get interested in fintech, and what sort of sparked that?
Yeah, I think. I guess it was a kind of realization about 5 or 6 years ago that London had a kind of traditional, if you like, strength in finance, and we were trying to build a strength in tech, not initially in fintech, but of course, most of this is driven by the innovation of the private sector. I'm not pretending that government sort of sits there like a puppet master. But we thought there were things that Britain could do to make it more tech-friendly, and we made a particular determined effort to build up East London as a tech centre, and that involved physical infrastructure going in, people like me phoning the heads of the big tech companies like Google and Cisco and saying, could you come and locate headquarters in the UK, and what can we do to attract you? So we were already pushing for tech. We had the strength in finance, and then it sort of seemed like a natural conjunction to try and make the UK a go-to place for fintech. I think at the same time, it's sort of neatly tied with a determination at that point to spread the avenues available for small businesses and indeed families to get access to finance. I mean, we were still in the kind of thick tail of the financial crash and the credit crunch. SME lending was a big issue. And it started not really as, a bit like your organisation, it started originally as a sort of peer-to-peer lending, as the idea of a way of getting an additional chain of finance there for British SMEs, which is why, for example, we allowed peer-to-peer lending products to go into ISAs and things like that. And I think that was just the start of what has happened, and the opening up of the banking system and the open banking regulations, the regulatory sandbox, all the things that followed we're also driven by this idea of let's break up the existing channels of finance because they've been very clogged by the crash.
Right. And so it's interesting because you look now, and I've been around this industry for a long time and been following it. And obviously, the peer-to-peer lenders were really the original fintech companies here in the UK. And now I look at the UK, and I'm actually somewhat envious because you have a great regulatory structure. We're in the United States. We have a very complex and difficult regulatory structure with many federal agencies and 50 state agencies that are coming in. So here, and you see some of some of the players. If you look at the global fintech industry, some of the most interesting players are all based here in London. I mean, it feels like you've got a real gathering of fantastic ideas. Do you feel like that has been the result of why do you think that is? You've got is it the regulatory environment? Is it the attraction of talent? Why has fintech really become so big here?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would never write off the kind of innovative environment in the United States.
Right.
I teach at Stanford University and at the Graduate School of Business there. I spent quite a lot of my time there. That is obviously still a very exciting place for innovation. And they're talking a lot about finance. At the same time, in China, where I've just come back from, in many ways, the kind of consumer experience of fintech is more advanced, actually, than in Western economies.
Yep.
That said, I think London and the UK has a number of natural advantages. First of all, it is not one of these very big jurisdictions. I think people are a bit suspicious of the US dollar and the use of the US dollar and US regulatory agencies to enforce US policy, which you might approve of or disapprove of, but companies will be nervous of falling foul of money laundering, for example, regulations in the United States. At the same time, in China, without going into the obvious features of the Chinese political system, it's not a straightforward place to do business either.
Right.
So I think the UK lends itself as a sort of more neutral international place to do your business with access to a big market. And I think there is something of a kind of cluster experience that this is the world's largest financial center. So there's just a lot of finance expertise here as well. And all those things come together, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think some sort of sensible government decisions around, not just by the Treasury and the regime I was part of, but by my successor, by Mark Carney at the Bank of England, by Andrew Bailey at the FCA, has created a much more permissive environment where we're kind of interested and excited to allow a bit of exploratory work to go on. The automatic view here is not like, this is all dangerous stuff we can't control, we don't want to see it. Right. It's kind of, let's see what can develop. And then I think, look, regulation will follow. I think one thing I would say is, there's a reason why finance is a heavily regulated sector, like healthcare and some other sectors. And that is because it directly touches on people's well-being, and governments have to pick up the pieces, as we saw 10 years ago when finance fails. So I wouldn't expect it to remain, and not just here, but across the world, as lightly a regulated a space. But I would think there's a very big role for your organization and people in this room to engage in that debate and try and shape that regulation rather than think it's never going to happen. I would argue that some of if you look at the big kind of social media platforms and tech companies, those that thought regulation was never coming are the ones that are in most trouble. Those that were sensible and said, let's engage in the regulation and shape it in a way that's appropriate for our business are the ones that are doing better. Right. I think in the fintech world, I would be regularly engaged, either as individual companies, but many of you are very small, so you don't have the capacity to do that or the time to do it, but through organizations, through industry groups, engage with the regulators so they understand what you're up to. Don't assume that people sitting in the Bank of England necessarily know everything that's happening in this sector. they'll want to know you to tell them, and I think you should.
Right, and I think the peer-to-peer lending industry did a great job with that and helped
Yes,
helped sort of shape the regulations there. I think that's a really good point. So I want to move to open banking because it's something that it's been talked about a lot at this event, and it's something that we've had it now. It's coming up on a year pretty soon since it was adopted. So how do you feel? Firstly, are you following the developments here in the banking space, in the fintech space? And it seems to me that it's going a little slowly. There hasn't really been a whole lot happen yet. What's your view? Should the big banks be moving quicker?
Well, with no disrespect to the big banks, but they're not going to move more quickly because this is a competitive threat to them.
Right.
And that's, with all the goodwill in the world. I think it was designed really for two purposes, the open banking regulations. One was to create more competition in personal banking. And obviously a big obstacle has been being able to move your credit history and the like, and get banking licenses actually. And we tried very hard to allow new banks to emerge. And second, actually, in the SME lending space as well, SME accounts are very sticky because SMEs find it very difficult to start all over again with a new bank. So that's where open banking started. Like all these things, I think there's a lot of hype when they're announced. Sometimes you then feel a bit disappointed, but the long-term implications are huge. Mm-hmm. So I'm still a big optimist that open banking regulation is going to be pretty dramatic for the industry, even if it has a sort of slow start. It's very much up to companies that want to make use of it to force the pace and challenge through regulators and through the law courts any obstacles they come across. I think an interesting thing is how it was interesting catching the end of that last panel. And actually, when I was a constituency MP, I was an MP in Cheshire, and I had Barclays Bank's big technology centre in my constituency. It was pretty much the biggest employer in my constituency, and I know they're very innovative. I know these larger banks, it'd be interesting how they are reacting to this, to all this innovation, particularly in the personal banking space. Will they develop their own technology? Will they enter partnerships like the one we were just hearing about? Will they acquire some of these companies? I suspect each bank will take a slightly different approach. But they're certainly alive to it in a way I think they probably weren't a couple of years ago.
Right, for sure. No, we've seen that just with the people coming here.
Those Monzo and Revolut cards are starting to make them a little bit nervous.
Right, yes, they're everywhere. So then are you following the blockchain and current cryptocurrency space very much? I mean, we had Chris Woolard from the FCA on stage here yesterday saying that he wants London to be a welcoming place for ICOs, obviously with built-in investor protections and strict anti-fraud protections as well. But I'd be curious to get your perspective on the cryptocurrency space and the blockchain space. While they are related, they're obviously somewhat separate. But have you been following this space closely?
Yeah, yes, pretty closely. I think let's take them in turn. I think there is. I was always a bit more positive about crypto than perhaps kind of other finance ministers. I think it's going to be a while before we work out as a world what the kind of digital means of exchange is, and it doesn't necessarily mean that existing players will survive. And obviously their values, fluctuate wildly, including this week. But I think the world is looking for an alternative to the US dollar. Mm-hmm. I think for a variety of reasons, there's a kind of interest in creating a kind of permanent globally accepted means of exchange that is out with the US law enforcement and regulatory space. There's a big interest in doing that in China, big interest in the European Union. And if you follow sort of international politics, actually the incident of the Iran nuclear deal has been a big driver of change here, where the US pulled out of this nuclear deal that Barack Obama had done, Donald Trump pulled out of it. The other countries who had signed it, including the UK, Germany, China, and so on, wanted to continue, but no no British company dares risk falling foul of US sanctions and can't bank with anyone that risks falling foul of US sanctions. So you just find in kind of international political circles much more talk now about finding an alternative to the dollar. I don't think it's going to be the euro or the renminbi or some other currency. So so I think there's space for a digital currency or a digital means of exchange. And I thought it was quite interesting to hear the IMF talking about that a week or two ago. So I think there's space. That doesn't mean I would put all my life savings into one of these cryptocurrencies or a coin. But I think, again, over the long term, it feels to me that is a very fruitful direction for innovation and change. Blockchain, obviously, critical to that, but I think critical to many other things because it provides, the technology holds out the promise of providing assurance and security in a world where that's obviously going to become more and more of a challenge, not just in the fintech space. I think, again, the only thing I would be a little bit cautious about, having been in government, is the idea of sort of irreversible transactions or irrecoverable sums of money where you've been defrauded, or it feels to me like that's not going to be acceptable to society, and legal rights are going to emerge, which I think the blockchain world is going to have to, if it's going to want to become an absolute sort of mainstream technology, we'll have to find ways around them. I think there are ways around.
So then what about central banks issuing digital currency? I mean, I think that's what the head of the IMF was really talking about. Do you think that's inevitable as we become a much more digital society?
Yes, I think that is the case. I mean, whether, as I say, it's a new currency or just a sort of digital form of an existing currency, I think there is going to be space for a new means of exchange. More sort of generally on the sort of digital, on the sort of cashless economy. It's actually one of the things I, look back and have a sort of a slight regret about, which is I had an idea, which was we could, in the UK, set a target of becoming a cashless economy and you set a date like 2030 or 2040, some time off. And that this would be a bit like with car emissions. We say, all cars have to be electric by a certain year. And then that drives change in the auto industry. I thought we could set a target for the UK to go cashless. And I was all set to announce this, and then I was sort of heavily advised that I would run into lots of objections from people, who use cash in their day-to-day lives, lower income people who don't, and the groups that represent them who can often find themselves unbanked, charities that at least feel they rely on kind of pennies into the tins on shop tills and stuff like that. And so I backed off, and I kind of regret that because it was sort of more. It was going to be more trouble than it was worth politically, but or it felt like it at the time. But I think actually it would be a good ambition, and I think it would then make the country that did it the kind of go-to place for innovation, and many of the businesses in this room would then say, that's a good place to go and help develop this cashless society. I think the cashless society is coming anyway. I mean, you certainly see that in China.
Right.
And even in this country now, just in my own personal experience, I quite often now find myself in shops and restaurants that don't accept cash. So sometimes, the tail end of maintaining cash as a payment system is going to be really expensive. They'll probably at some point a government will want to say, right, here's the cut-off point at some point in the future.
Right. Okay, we're going to switch to the audience questions now. If we can put the Slido screen up, and you can see them on there. So let's go with the top question there. What would you say to fresh faces looking into fintech investment roles post-Brexit? Will fresh jobs dry up here? And obviously written by a German, I'm guessing, move to Germany.
Well, I think Berlin is a great city, and in Germany is a massive economy. So I don't think we should be too sort of surprised that there's also a nascent tech industry in Germany. I think this is one of those sectors that will be potentially least affected by Brexit, particularly, by the way, if we go on abiding by all the EU rules. I mean, in a way, the EU hadn't quite kind of caught up with tech by the time the British people voted to leave.
Right.
So it's one of the areas where you still see, for example, big tech companies choosing to make their European investments in the UK. I think the kind of crucial question will be, I sort of alluded to it earlier, do we remain an open international economy with an immigration system that welcomes talent from around the world? Those are the questions we face. If our answer to that is no, then yeah, the jobs will go elsewhere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So then, do you have any personal regrets about Brexit?
I notice this is anonymous. This one. Right. Yeah, look, of course, I was part of the government that had that referendum, mm-hmm. and I argued very strongly that Britain shouldn't leave. And although I kept it secret at the time, because I was part of a team, I wasn't in favour of having a referendum in the first place. Right. So yeah, obviously, I regret the decisions that were taken, and I regret the outcome of the referendum. But in the end, it was a big democratic exercise, and that was a pretty high turnout. So I don't think you can say, the country didn't take part in this decision. It did. Right.
Okay. So then, what? This applies to not just Britain. Yeah. Of course, this next question applies to just as much to the United States, if not more so. Who can realistically bring people together, or what can realistically bring people together and lead Britain out of this mess?
I think I fundamentally don't believe that the country wants a choice only between Jacob Rees-Mogg and Jeremy Corbyn, if I can be. Right. I do actually think the world I grew up in politically of centre-left, centre-right, arguing for essentially a more sort of moderate, progressive international government with perhaps a bit more public spending on one side and a bit lower taxes on the other, but that so-called centre, that centre ground still exists. I still think that's what a lot of people are looking for. And politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum, so something will fill it. I think it's worth remembering we're still, if you're UK specific here, very early on in the days of this parliament. It's only been going for just over a year. It's a 5-year parliament, at least in theory. So a lot can happen. If you think of what's happened in Britain over the last 2 years, over the next 4 years, a lot can happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, let's go with Susie Newworth here from P2P Finance News has asked, what do you think of the progress of the Innovative Finance ISA so far? I'm
not, to be honest, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, it'd be interesting to get the feedback from people here. I mean, we've created the vehicle. I'm not clear yet how.
Right. Well, I think a lot of the sense is that we thought it would be more popular than what it has been. I think that's the.
I will just it comes back to an answer I gave earlier, which is, sometimes expectations can be set very high, and if they're not immediately met, there's a sense that a product or an approach has failed, and then you come back 3 or 4 years later, and actually, of course, it's been a massive driver of change.
Right.
And so, I think as long as you create the channels, then the private sector, the people in this room, will through their innovation, find ways. Because, essentially, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to the existing big players, but, people have not, they want something. They want better service in their finance, and that's where these challenges have emerged. And people also want to find new ways to invest their money. So I'm confident this will work, even if it hasn't been quite as dramatic a start as people.
Right, now, because people maybe unrealistically now, in hindsight, we were at this event 2 years ago where people were talking about a wall of cash coming in.
Yeah.
When
people are quite cautious at the moment, anyway, and. People who've been selling, investment products for years will know it's quite difficult to get people to come out of cash. But
yeah. Okay, so then moving on, how will open banking succeed if the banks seek to thwart it?
Well, I think I think I touched on this earlier. I don't think it's the banks will sort of seek to thwart it in a, sort of deliberately conspiratorial and malicious way. It's just they won't be that keen to see it kind of work and won't be necessarily trying to fix the bugs in it. So I think it will require the industry that benefits from it to keep pushing, to go and see the regulators. The regulators are invested in making this work. It's their idea, they're implementing this idea. The current set of regulators in the UK are, I think, very open and supportive of open banking. So, I think but again, I think don't assume perfect knowledge. Don't assume that everyone at the FCA or everyone at the Bank of England or everyone at the Treasury knows the practical obstacles some of you are facing. Go and tell them.
Right.
And in my experience, as I say, particularly with the current team in those different institutions, I think they would be pretty receptive.
No, in fact, Chris Willard said that yesterday. He said, we want people to come
Yeah.
talk to us. Yes. Okay, so then what are you most excited about regarding open banking and fintech?
Well, I think it's just, if you were thinking of industries that are ripe for huge disruption, I think you would say finance is one of them. And I think we're just at the beginning of that revolution. I think what you've seen, I edited a newspaper, right? What you've seen in media over the last 10 years, huge disruption, new players, massive new players, now some of the biggest companies in the world. I think that's all coming to finance. The other sector, it's not this conference, healthcare is another, hugely regulated, heavily protected, lots of vested interests industry where, again, technology, I think, can bring a huge amount of disruption. So I just think this is one of the most exciting spaces in our economy for the coming 10 years.
Right. So I don't know if you'll answer this next question, but do you invest personally in fintech companies, Bitcoin, P2P lending, or anything?
Well, rather annoyingly, actually, I did actually, as Chancellor, get given some Bitcoin. And we had a Bitcoin, we were kind of highlighting a sort of Bitcoin ATM.
Okay.
Where you could use your Bitcoin to get cash out. But because the British government is very proper, I had to I was given Bitcoin to undertake this transaction in front of the cameras, and I then had to return it. Otherwise,
right, of course, yes.
I would, even with the big fall in value recently, have got a lot of cash.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what would your next move be if you were Prime Minister?
Well, look, I think it's all about Brexit, isn't it?
Of course,
yeah. I think personally Britain's attempt to create some sort of unique relationship with the EU, a bespoke relationship, is not going to work because we ourselves can't agree. Our cabinet can't agree. Our governing party can't agree. Our parliament can't agree. The people in this room probably who are British can't agree. So I would go personally for a close relationship with the EU, like the European Economic Area or EFTA. These are the organisations that countries like Norway and Switzerland are in, which last time I checked are pretty proudly independent countries. I think we can be part of those sorts of organisations and have therefore a formal or existing means of engagement with the EU that already exists. And I think that would more fairly represent a result of a country that was split 48-52 on the referendum.
Right. Okay, so then we have a lot of Americans here. So do you expect a new trade agreement with the US following Brexit?
Probably not, actually, to be honest. I know it's much talked about. Well, because as far as I can see, we're going to be in the customs union for a very long time. Mm-hmm. That, I think, by the way, is a good thing because our key trading partners are our neighbours, our near neighbours, as well as the US. And I also I'm all for doing more trade with the rest of the world, including the United States. I was a big proponent of doing more trade with China. Most of these trade agreements you can do outside, whilst you're in the EU regime. Indeed, the best thing would be an EU-US trade deal. And then when I think of what would be a kind of UK trade deal with the US, well, you have to ask yourself, obviously we buy lots of things from the US already. And I've got my iPhone on me, and JP Morgan's got a big bank here. So what is it that a US trade deal offers that you don't currently get, right? So I think people, by the way, the same applies to a Chinese trade deal. What is it that you would buy from China you don't currently buy, or sell to China you can't currently sell? And what would you have to pay to get that? So I think a US trade deal would actually end up being pretty controversial because it would involve things like taking hormone-injected beef, genetically modified plant products. I think you'd have to allow US companies in to bid for things like NHS contracts. And I can think of quite a lot of people in the British House of Commons who would have a problem with that.
Right. Okay, another interesting question here that's been voted up. You and the former Prime Minister still talk to each other?
We do. We had a nice drink last week, actually.
Okay.
We are godfathers to each other's children, so it'd be pretty
really?
sad. I mean, do you know that? I mean, I'm sure people here, found companies with partners and friends, and that. One of the looking back on my time in government, politics can be a rough business. But I had, right at the kind of core of my political career, a very strong friendship with David Cameron. And that was, great. And I think it also made the government function more effectively.
Right, for sure. So then is access to talent the biggest concern as a result of Brexit?
Well, I think it is a big concern. I'm not sure where I'd make I guess, if you look at the biggest picture, does at the moment the West look like it's kind of holding together and united? Is Brexit, if you're sitting in Moscow or indeed in Beijing, look anything other than like the disintegration of the Western alliances? And do we think Brexit is going to amplify Britain's role in the world or diminish it? I fear it's going to diminish it. So I guess I would have some sort of bigger concerns about Brexit, but certainly, I think London and the rest of the UK succeeds because we are open to talent. I think this feels like a more international city than almost anywhere else in the world, even New York, and that's reflected in this audience. And I would want to maintain that post-Brexit.
Okay, I think this will have to be our last question here. With an unprecedented 75% of UK voting and Brexit passing with a significant majority, why do you think people are now backpedaling?
Well, I don't think it was passed with a significant majority for a start. It was 48% to 52%. And I think essentially the kind of promises made of Brexit are so clearly undeliverable that people have real concerns about it. And I think in a way, many of the problems that have emerged for the government have been because they've tried to deliver a sort of, they've tried to just go with the 17 million people who voted for Brexit, not the 16 million people who voted to remain, and a more national and inclusive approach, I think, would have been less divisive.
I am going to ask one more question because I think this is an interesting one here. What concerns should British people have in dealing with President Trump?
Well, I think most British people don't have to deal with President Trump.
The elected officials then.
I think the relationship with the US is a very close one for the UK. It's the foundation of our national security, but operates at many other levels, commercial, familial, people have family relationships and so on. And the United States has, been a very strong ally and remains so. The problem that President Trump presents is essentially a sort of unpredictability, that you, and this is sort of obvious to anyone who follows him, that, it's a difficult friend to count on when you're not entirely sure how they're going to react to things or what they're going to say or whatever. But, that said, as I say, the American-British alliance exists at many levels below the White House, and that's a good thing.
Right. Okay, Mr. Osborne, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. It was great.